Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Monday, the 11th of September, where we are beginning our conversation about the Gothic. Last class, I reviewed the syllabus and the course outline. I'm hopeful that it made sense and that you don't have any questions for me, but if you do, please feel free to reach out. I also had a discussion forum question for you with introductions, and I responded to each of you. As I indicated, you're not required to respond to your classmates in the discussion forum, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. As you can see, I responded to each of you, welcoming you to the class. And since I still haven't had a chance to introduce myself, I thought that I would do that now. And it begins in New York City, which is where I was born and raised. But I attended college in upstate New York, the University of Rochester. I'm fond of saying how when I was looking at those college catalogs, I was very impressed with the way the University of Rochester marketed itself as a place where students could experience, quote, real winters, unquote. Well, I was very young and naive. That sounded more romantic than difficult. It was a little bit of both, actually. But I am there in college, majoring in English, minoring in psychology, because I'm absolutely positively certain I'm going to be a lawyer. And that goes to show how career plans can change over the course of your academic career. I took a Shakespeare class and fell in love and decided that I really wanted to focus my attention on literature. So off I go to graduate school, this time in a warm climate so that I don't have to experience real winters. I settled on Southern California, UCLA to be exact, and there are no winters there. There are earthquakes and mudslides and very expensive real estate, it turns out, surrounding the campus. But I was to learn all of that when I was there, studying Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And then I eventually finished with my graduate degree, began teaching, decided that I really wanted to return home. And in my mind, home could be defined by anything on the East Coast. So I began applying to positions, and there was a school by the name of Greenfield Community College that had an open position. So you know how ultimately this story will end. And I came out for an interview, and I was very impressed that the community lived up to its name. It was a place with fields that were green. California was in the midst of a drought at that point, and we definitely didn't have green fields. And I remember accepting the position and being told not to worry too much because the winters here in Massachusetts really are, quote, not that bad, unquote. Well, I began in the 1993-94 academic school year, and the reality is it was one of the worst winters in Massachusetts history. Perhaps you read about that winter. We broke all kinds of existing records. Everyone was unprepared, especially me. But I've been here ever since, mostly teaching English classes, but I do teach some public speaking classes, and I also teach some media classes. And as you know, when I reviewed the syllabus, I had indicated that I wanted to leave the plagiarism section for today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, as well as talk about the first set of readings that I had assigned today from Stephen King. It's a kind of introduction to what the Gothic is, and then talk a little bit about what's coming up over the course of this semester. You might have noticed that in the way that I've structured this particular class, I'm not using the electronic grading program. So there's still enough of a dinosaur in me that I do a combination of both electronic and paper. But certainly at any point in the semester, if you needed a sense of grades, certainly you could reach out to me. And again, as you know, the way the class is structured is that a good portion of the class is based on those classroom discussion forum responses. A good portion of the class is based on our first paper, which we will talk about shortly. A good portion of the class is based on our second paper, which is due towards the ending of the semester. And a good portion of the class is based on our final examination, which is open book, open notes. And it's basically a cumulative review of what we've talked about in this semester. So those are the four elements that are being used for evaluation. But in terms of plagiarism, this is a conversation in and of itself. As you know, I've got a section in the syllabus that I took from the MLA, the Modern Language Association, making sure to document very carefully their language, which is one of the things that you need to do to avoid plagiarism. Because plagiarism is basically using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. As long as you acknowledge the source so that it doesn't appear that it's coming from you, you're giving proper credit, then you're not plagiarizing. And we talk about plagiarism very similar to theft, except it's intellectual theft rather than property theft. But same sort of level of consequences, and that if you were to be caught, at the very least, if you were to be caught plagiarizing, you would fail that assignment. And at the very most, you would be expelled with a notation on your transcript that you plagiarized. And then I would tell 2 stories, I still do, about plagiarism. One that occurred to me very early on in my career, pre-internet, as I'm reading a set of papers and I realized something sounds familiar. Not unusual for teachers since we're pretty well read. But since it was early on in my career, I didn't have any of the electronic resources that exist today to determine if something was being plagiarized. Like Turnitin.com, for instance, where I could type in a sentence or a paragraph and do database search. But it didn't take me long to figure out that what I was reading was actually just about verbatim from our class textbook, with a few mechanical errors here and there. I don't know if that was merely because the person was sloppy in recopying, or they were hopeful that a few errors might convince me that this was their original work. The better story, which occurred around the same time, but did not occur to me, was in all the academic newspapers. Yes, there is such a thing as academic newspapers. There is a middle-aged professor, that part is important, reading papers. Something sounds familiar. And again, he can't go to the internet. And as he continues to contemplate, he realizes where he had read this. No, he hadn't read this before. He had written this before. This was one of his old college papers from decades previous. And it had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling papers. But somehow, some way, this professor's own student got a hold of one of this professor's old papers. Not only was the student caught plagiarizing, but it became a media story because of the unlikelihood of such a thing occurring. And then I would usually talk a little bit about how embedded within the course are ways to revise and improve your grade, and that I encourage critical papers, which are based on your own interpretation rather than research papers, because research papers require more than just gathering outside information. You still have to add your own, but I know that sometimes with research papers it might become a bit confusing, trying to determine what was your material and what was the material that you saw from an outside source. And usually that speech would suffice, but everything has changed with artificial intelligence, which is growing almost exponentially. I'm assuming you know what I'm talking about, programs such as ChatGPT. And I encourage you not to use them in this particular class. And there are multiple reasons why. And I've got my own personal concerns about artificial intelligence. I like to joke that The Terminator is a great movie to see if you want to get a sense of how technology can exceed the abilities of mankind to control it, which actually happens to be the theme in our first major Gothic text that we'll be reading this semester, Frankenstein. So new ideas are sometimes old ideas. But besides from that, and I've done quite a bit of reading on ChatGPT, I find it quite fascinating that they're using the term hallucination to discuss how ChatGPT is giving wrong information. I always thought of that as lying, but now the perhaps euphemism is hallucination. And yes, it could be argued that there's something wrong with the algorithm, but it's highly unlikely because ChatGPT scours the internet. What's more likely is, and no one really understands why, it's deliberately giving misinformation. Whether it's deliberate or not, you certainly don't want to be in the position where you're using ChatGPT and you are presenting misinformation, which actually happened to an attorney recently who used ChatGPT in a courtroom case. Basically, in his legal brief, ChatGPT had cited multiple previous court cases that never existed. And even though the attorney had asked ChatGPT point blank, are these cases valid? And ChatGPT assured him that they were. The judge actually used the old-fashioned method of looking them up in books, and none of them existed. I find that to be quite troubling. The idea, too, that ChatGPT is learning exponentially, the speed that it is utilizing, so that we can't necessarily predict how it's going to impact elements of our society. Things like the economy. These sorts of changes happen over decades. They shouldn't happen over weeks. I don't know if our economy is able to withstand these sorts of changes. This is just my personal opinion. And the fact that ChatGPT is using basically our language, our responses, our usage to grow and learn. So if you watch media, then you are well aware of the Hollywood strike that's going on now, the actor strike, where there's great concern, not only over the fact that ChatGPT is already using the materials that have been created by artists and writers, but that ChatGPT will replace artists and writers, perhaps even actors, because their image could be used. So I put all of those pieces together, and then I think about the point of this class, which is not only to experience learning, which is the point of all classes, but also, as many of you indicated in your response forums, that you're interested in the Gothic. And if you are interested in the Gothic, then you should read it and write about it, rather than relying on some outside source. So that's my long-winded way of encouraging you not to use ChatGPT or other artificial intelligence programs, at least in the context of this particular semester. I've actually rethought some of the assignments that I do over the course of the semester. I'll be sharing some paper topics with you next week and talk a little bit about how I've made some changes based on some of the new advances that have occurred in the last several months. But now it's time to finally talk about Gothic. And Stephen King is a very famous author in the horror tradition. He used all of the classics, but his brilliance is that he was able to make them contemporary and modern. Rather than setting things with aristocratic England, he would oftentimes set things in middle-class America. Same stories, just with different twists. And would oftentimes spend a good amount of time developing character and also thought processes of character, which is something you don't always see in the early Gothic. So Stephen King is known best for his pieces of fiction, and in fact we'll end the semester by reading some of his short stories, just because his novels tend to be rather lengthy, and I know that we don't have time in the semester to be doing something like that. But I wanted to begin with text of Stephen King that you might be less familiar with, entitled Danse Macabre, where Stephen King did a review of the Gothic tradition. Stephen King has a degree in English and actually has taught classes in supernatural literature, both at the high school and college level. So he is, in many ways, an expert. And Stephen King has his own unique style. So if you haven't read King before, then you can see that he's very colloquial and he's very informal. He's in direct contrast to the next person we'll be reading next class, which is H.P. Lovecraft. They're both basically talking about the same topics, but they're doing it in very different ways. And I'll talk a little bit more about H.P. Lovecraft in a few moments. But in terms of Stephen King, I had assigned 3 chapters from his text, Danse Macabre, Invitation to Dance, Tales of the Hook, and Tales of the Tarot. And you can see that beneath this video are the notes for this particular video. They are literally the notes that I have for myself to talk about these concepts. And chapter 1 in Danse Macabre, note I didn't give page numbers because I indicated that you could use any edition of the books that you wanted to. But if you wanted to purchase a book through the GCC bookstore, certainly you could do so. And as long as I'm able to find links for you online for these texts, I will provide them to you. So you can see that under the section for topic, I was able to find the link for Danse Macabre for those first 3 chapters as well. I personally prefer to have text in hard copy. I think it's much easier to annotate and to be able to manipulate those texts, but the choice is yours. So we haven't necessarily gotten into the Gothic fiction yet. This class and next class will be preparing us for that. And our first Gothic fictional text will be Frankenstein, which I'll talk about in a few moments. But Danse Macabre, I just wanted to talk about the title, is a medieval term that means dance of death. That in medieval times, then definitely death was much more present, I think, in society than it is today. Certainly just because of the incidence of disease, much more prevalent back then, and lifespans being much shorter. But there was this sense of not only death being universal, but that there was a certain level of dark artistry associated with it. There is a beauty associated with darkness. If you are familiar with Emily Dickinson, then you know that much of her poetry is about death and some of the beauty associated with the possibilities of death and afterlife. But at any rate, this dance of death, there are woodcut images of skeletons dancing to the idea of death. And if you look at the notes below, I've included a link for one of those woodcut images that I encourage you to look at of dancing skeletons. Stephen King argues that perhaps death is our biggest fear because death is the biggest unknown. Regardless of your philosophical or your spiritual or religious beliefs, we don't have necessarily definitive external proof about what happens after death. So King talks about that's something that is discussed in the Gothic and also in horror film in a way that provides a certain level of safety because ultimately this is fictional. So it allows us, in the way that King would say, a kind of dress rehearsal to engage in death, to talk about and to consider these very complex ideas in a way that is much less intimidating than if we were actually experiencing them in real life. Very similar to perhaps what I call, the need to ride the roller coaster. That there are some people who love it and some people who hate it. And those who love it love the adrenaline rush. It wouldn't be an enjoyable experience if their car was acting in the same way. But the idea that the roller coaster is under a certain level of control, so that means it's probably under a certain level of safety, makes the experience less scary and more enjoyable. Though there is a thin line between the two. I don't know if you've ever noticed how often people laugh when they're scared. So again, there is a thin line between the two. But King talks about that this is perhaps the reason why we read these texts and perhaps the reason why we watch these movies. And he says there are 3 levels from his perspective. The first being the gross out. This is revulsion. It's the lowest level. It's done primarily for entertainment and profit. And the second level, which is a little bit more advanced, King calls the creeps, which creates anxiety in an audience. And then the third level is terror. This is about the fear of disestablishment, and it requires the greatest use of audience imagination, and it's the highest level. And that all 3 are effective, and King says he's not proud. He'll use all 3. But the goal is terror, at least in terms of texts that have some level of academic value to them. He says that these texts oftentimes examine the national phobic pressure points of our society, which is basically an idea that I'm examining in the book that I told you that I'm writing, in that horror, whether it be film or whether it be in text, whether we want to call it the classical Gothic or the more contemporary horror, basically is a way for us to examine societal anxiety of the time, the political, the economic, and the psychological anxieties of the time. And that these texts are symbolic or allegorical, much like all great pieces of literature are usually symbolic or allegorical. They can be read literally, but they also can be read symbolically. They are representational, they are abstract. And we use symbols all the time in our society. The flag is supposed to be a symbol for patriotism. Patriotism is this amorphous thing. It's not something that you could touch or necessarily see, but it can be represented through flag. And we do this all the time. Some symbols are very obvious, and some perhaps less obvious, and authors tend to use a little bit of both in their writing. And then we, as readers or as viewers of film, have to try to think about what those symbols might represent. And that the result of going through this experience results in catharsis, that purging of emotion. Again, the roller coaster ride, as I was referencing earlier, that there is a vicarious thrill associated with that. If you're familiar with the play Oedipus the King, which is something that I do in my introduction to lit classes and introduction to film classes, then you are very familiar with the idea of catharsis, which is a Greek term actually. Chapter 2 in Danse Macabre, Stephen King talks of Tales of the Hook, which happens to be one of those old stories, Tales of the Hook, that oftentimes is told around campfires in order to scare children, let's say on summer camp, about how there is this mass murderer that's on the loose who has a hook for a hand, and then you have a couple who is driving around and they happen to be in the area where this mass murderer happens to be. They're parked and they're engaging in a romantic moment, but because of the fear or anxiety associated with the possibility of this individual pursuing them, one of the members of the couple is persuaded to leave by the other member, much to the chagrin of the driver, and he basically drives off. Usually the way the story is told is that it's a he and a she, though it doesn't necessarily have to be that particular coupling. And he drives off and he brings his date back home, and what he realizes to his horror as he opens up the car door is that there's a hook embedded in it. In other words, that the mass murderer was very close to entering their car when they were parked and they just barely escaped. Of course, if you tell it right in the right atmosphere, it can be frightening. And Gothic and horror is so much about atmosphere. If you don't believe it, just think about Halloween. And I can't believe that we already have Halloween decorations out, but indeed we do. And you know it's all about setting the mood, the atmosphere. But at any rate, King talks about how this genre, which is a category or kind of writing, Gothic or horror, can oftentimes blend with other categories or genres, such as science fiction. And Frankenstein is a wonderful example that's been categorized both as horror, something that is supernatural, something that defies the laws of the natural world, but also something that is science fiction, something that could be accomplished through science. It just hasn't necessarily yet been done. And sometimes you have stories that meld into other genres. Harry Potter might be a good example, where you've got fantasy along with supernatural. And that these texts are oftentimes maligned. They're seen as being written to the common denominator, the lowest common denominator, purely for profit and entertainment, and that they usually don't have much value. I don't think that's necessarily true. As I had shared with you, I teach media classes. I think anything can be analyzed from an academic perspective. In one of the media classes I teach, Media and Popular Culture, we will analyze things like television commercials, for instance, which are definitely not meant to be analyzed, and talk about how we could apply the same principles of critical thinking and critical writing and critical interpretation to them. So I think, and so does King, that these texts are oftentimes misunderstood, especially the well written texts, the ones that do more than just trying to provoke fear, but make some sort of social commentary. That's what we'll be talking about over the course of this semester. King argues, and I agree, that there's a cyclical popularity usually associated with this. King says that it oftentimes is a result of a new generation. Adolescents, in particular, have been found to be particularly drawn to Gothic and horror, in part because it embraces the breaking of taboos, which is something that adolescents are doing. I would add to that and say that each generation, we've got a new political cycle. And I think that and just some of the historical changes that can occur from a decade perspective are some of the reasons why we see that cyclicality in Gothic and in horror. Talking about the idea of being able to engage in the deviant, I mean, even just the definition of deviant is subjective, as is the definition of normality. Don't know if you've ever seen the old Twilight Zone episode, the original Twilight Zone, one of my favorite TV shows. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and it illustrates this idea about the subjective nature of normality so well. It's a woman who's undergoing plastic surgery. We don't see her face throughout most of the episode. It's covered in bandages. She's undergoing plastic surgery to improve her appearance. And towards the ending of the episode, the bandages are removed and she looks at herself in the mirror and she yells out in fright. Obviously, the surgery has not been successful, except at this point we see her face, and by any standard of our society, the surgery was quite successful. She looks quite beautiful. And then the camera pans out to the doctors and nurses who appear to be like these pig deformed monstrosities. In other words, that's the standard of normality in this society, these pig individuals. And she's considered abnormal. If you're familiar with another television show around the same time that also utilized this idea, albeit to humorous effect, and that would be the not the Addams Family, but what was it? The Addams Family? Yeah, I think it was the Addams Family, where you had a member of. No, it wasn't the Addams Family. It was, the name escapes me, but it'll come to me if I don't think about it too hard. Where there was the Munsters. That's it. Where every member of the family represented some sort of a monster, and then the odd quote unquote family member was someone who would appear to be normal in our own society. But moving on to Stephen King's third chapter, Danse Macabre, Tales of the Tarot. So you might be familiar with the tarot deck, which is oftentimes associated with the supernatural and being able to get a sense of the other realm beyond the human realm. That, according to King, and I tend to agree, that many of these tales basically are not so much deviant as they are agents of the norm and morality tales. If you know anything about morality tales, they began in the medieval period. They were basically biblical stories that were dramatized in order to illustrate some sort of theme or point. And if you think about Gothic tales, more often than not, evil is vanquished and good prevails. And there is this sense of morality that's embedded within it, as we will see. Most of these stories have become familiar to us, not through text, but through film. As I had indicated, I also teach a class in horror film. And texts like Frankenstein or Dracula, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, 3 texts that we'll be reading this semester, but 3 texts have become iconic because of the film industry. So they really made them available to the masses. And much like all film, the changes were made, but ultimately, I wanted us to talk about the text, but also as a supplement, talk about the film. If you ever take my horror film class, it's exactly the other way around. That the focus is on the film, and then we'll, as a supplement, talk about the text. So, according to King, there are 3 basic horror stories. Something about a thing, this creature that really can't be explained. In other words, much like a Frankenstein tale, this creation that is unlike anything that exists. The vampire, which of course is perhaps best illustrated by Dracula, a creature that lives off of the life force of another. And then the werewolf, the idea of transformation. The Wolfman is probably one of the best examples, but even something like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which if you are not familiar with that text, you will be by the ending of the semester, because we are reading all three. They're usually considered to be the three classic Gothic texts. And if you are using the edition of the text that I had ordered for this class, you'll see that all three of them are combined into one volume, with an introduction by Stephen King, no less. So internal or external horror is something that we'll be grappling with over the course of the semester. What is more frightening? Is it an external horror, for instance, a monster or supernatural entity that's attacking? Or is it internal horror, the evil that exists within us that can't be controlled? Or perhaps some combination of the two? There's a great literary tradition to talk about horror and to talk about the supernatural. Think about some of the great Shakespearean plays, such as Hamlet, or particularly Macbeth, which is known for the three witches. If you're familiar with Beowulf, the great medieval epic poem, same sort of idea. But usually the more contemporary texts, such as Frankenstein or Dracula or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, are usually not considered to have the same level of gravitas. And not that I'm claiming that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has the same level of gravitas as Macbeth, but I think that it has as many literary possibilities for interpretation, which is why this class exists. So Gothic, just to talk a little bit about the definition, it's an architectural term. And if you are familiar with Gothic cathedrals, then you're familiar with these large, majestic constructions with pointed arches. They were considered to be rather excessive and barbarian at the time, so Gothic was more of a negative term. And now, of course, they're considered to be majestic and quite beautiful. It's also a historical term. So if you know your history, the Germanic Goths were these brutal conquerors. Again, they were known as barbarians, not necessarily a positive thing when you think about the idea of Gothic literature. And the term Gothic was first applied to a novel entitled The Castle of Otranto, which was written in 1764 by the British Horace Walpole. If you look at the notes below under section 4, you will see that I have included a link to that book. No, you are not required to read that book. But if you are ever curious, and I'm the first to admit, it's a poorly written book, but it has the conventions that have become established in the Gothic tradition. So it helped to bring about conventions like secret passageways and mystery. In fact, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to Edgar Allan Poe, who is credited with creating the contemporary mystery story. With death, decay, distress, victimization, omens, curses, nightmares, eerie atmosphere, doubling, something called a doppelganger, a twinning, in effect, that we will examine as the semester progresses. Possible supernatural activity, but there's usually some ambiguity in there. So for audiences who are skeptical about the supernatural, there usually is the possibility of embracing a more realistic explanation. This term and this kind of writing became popular in 1800s Europe. That's when we think about the great Gothic texts, such as Frankenstein, Dracula, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, texts that more contemporary authors, such as Stephen King, would be very familiar with. But of course, they use those as springboards to put their own mark on the tradition. So you can expect to see many of these conventions. Again, that's usually viewed as a negative if you are writing in a genre that has lots of predictable elements. But I like to say so is Shakespeare. If you know anything about Shakespeare's writing, he wrote different kinds of genres for his plays. Comedies, histories, tragedies, tragic comedies. And they did follow predictable elements, but they also had interesting things, unique things, creative things to examine within them. And I think that's what you'll find in the text as well. And what I wanted to do was to continue our introduction of the Gothic next class by talking about another Gothic author that you may be familiar with, an older author, H.P. Lovecraft. And we also will be reading some of H.P. Lovecraft's short stories. about midway through the semester, but he wrote an essay entitled Supernatural Horror in Literature. It's a rather long essay. It's almost like a novella. A novella is longer than a short story, but it is shorter than a novel. And it's his perception, H.P. Lovecraft's perception, on what is Gothic and what is supernatural horror. I can tell you right now, Lovecraft's writing style is very different from Stephen King's. Lovecraft is very academic. Although Lovecraft was an American, he's very much an Anglophile, so he's trying to mimic the inflections of the British. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons why when we get to Lovecraft. His writing is not the easiest to read. I'm the first to admit it. And he is incredibly well read in the tradition, making references to all kinds of texts. And I don't expect that you would have read all those texts. In fact, I haven't read all these texts. So when you get to something that you don't understand, or there's a reference to a text that you haven't read, please don't despair. Just skip over that and continue. Try to get a holistic sense of what it is that Lovecraft is trying to discuss about what he thinks horror and supernatural and Gothic are. And I will try to dissect this for us all as a class, next class. And then this is the ending of our introduction before we actually get into the Gothic text. You can see in the section below, section 5, I was able to find a link for Lovecraft's essay, though I encourage you to have a hard copy of it. But if you need an electronic version, there you are. What we're going to do after Lovecraft is spend 2 weeks on Frankenstein. Now, as I had indicated during the first class, what's ideal, though I'm well aware that life is not always ideal, is that by the time we are assigned to begin talking about Frankenstein, you have read it in its entirety. That said, we've got 2 weeks devoted to it, so you may not necessarily been able to do that. But my hope is that you are not only just reading the introductory material from Stephen King and from H.P. Lovecraft, but that you are also beginning to tackle Frankenstein as well. If you're familiar with Frankenstein from the movies, this is a very different kind of Frankenstein, the text. We'll talk about some of the reasons why the movies are so different from the text. And we will also talk about film and why film is so pivotal for the Frankenstein tradition. I was able to find a link for the text Frankenstein through Project Gutenberg. Wonderful project to get lots of texts that have been scanned online. So you can see that text that's included in the notes below. But again, I hope you're able to get a hard copy. But if you need to rely on an electronic copy, that's an option. And it'll start probably very differently than what you would expect. Most readers expect that iconic creation scene of the creature, and instead what we get is a character named Walton, something that the films never talk about, and we'll talk about some of those differences and so forth when we get to Frankenstein as well. I've even sometimes had students asking, am I reading the right text? Yes, you are reading the right text. So it begins with someone named Walton. So you can see that I have our next question for our class discussion forum scheduled for Wednesday. And I ask that you talk a little bit about what frightens you and some of the reasons why. Because ultimately this class is about fear. And why is it that someone would willingly embrace fear? Which is what seems to be that we've all done, myself included, teaching the class, and you, and taking the class. It seems to be counterintuitive. Why would somebody want something like this? But then again, you have people who enjoy watching sad movies that make them cry. That also seems counterintuitive, unless you wanted to think about the idea of catharsis. But I'm quite interested. And notice that this question doesn't have a right or wrong answer. I very much enjoy asking questions that don't have a right or wrong answer. I'm really interested in your thinking and your reasoning, not necessarily in a factual answer that can be found on the internet. And while you're not required to respond to your classmates, you are required to read all your classmates' responses. And certainly if you feel moved to respond to one of your classmates, please do so, the way you would do in a face-to-face class. But I will read all of your responses and respond in turn. And my little cartoon at the bottom here is about books and the banning of books. I don't believe in banned books and in censorship. And in fact, many times, many of the texts that are considered to be Gothic have been texts that have been considered to be inappropriate or even banned. And again, you have to think about the reasoning for banning a particular book, but I don't believe in banning or censorship of anything. I think that ultimately an individual should be able to judge on their own. And we do live in interesting political times where this is becoming more and more of a political subject about what texts individuals should be allowed or not allowed to consume. And I just thought that this cartoon was relevant considering the time period, and perhaps even relevant when we examine these texts over the course of the semester. So you can see below, it's about banned books. I'll just let you read it on your own. But I would say that all texts have some validity in one way or another. It's just some have more value than others, perhaps. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. We will continue on next class. I will post a video on Wednesday. As you know, I had indicated I will post a video every Monday and every Wednesday at 8 a.m. So you can count on that, though I will try to post them even before that time period, but certainly by that time period. And I'm looking forward to hearing about what frightens you and why. Take care. Bye-bye.